The first time the new cook saw Jedediah Holleran, he was just a silhouette on a horse, dark against a sunrise that bled pale gold across the empty plains. He looked less like a man and more like a piece of the landscape, something carved from rock and silence that had been there forever. She'd come a long, long way to get to this ranch, a place called Red Mesa, and every mile had been paid for with a piece of her soul. Her name was Lily Junn Carter, and she was running from a past that had teeth. She arrived in a rickety wagon, her back straight as a fence post, her hands clenched tight in her lap. She wasn't expecting a welcome. She never was. Just a job, a roof, and enough quiet to let the ghosts of the last town fade away. Jed helped her down from the wagon. His hands were rough, calloused from a lifetime of work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He didn't say much, just, "You're the new cook." It wasn't a question. That night, the bunkhouse was loud with the talk of hungry men, tired from a long day with the cattle. Lily Junn moved through the small kitchen, the air thick with the smell of stew and wood smoke. She felt their eyes on her back, sizing her up, the way men always did. And that's when she met Dusty Rohr. He was the foreman, a man who wore his authority like a cheap suit, 2 sizes too small. He was loud where Jed was quiet, mean where Jed was steady. He leaned his chair back on 2 legs, a smirk already playing on his lips, his eyes sharp and cruel. When the plates of stew hit the table, Dusty took one slow, deliberate bite. He chewed for a long moment, then let his mouth twist. "Beans again?" he drawled, his voice loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. "Ain't you got more in that bag of tricks, miss?" A few of the younger hands chuckled, nervous little sounds that died in their throats. Jed sat at the end of the table, his head down, but Lily Junn knew he was listening. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to do what she'd always done. Stay quiet, apologize, make herself small. But something inside her, something worn thin from running, finally snapped. She didn't look up from the pot she was stirring. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "It's what I was told to make," she said. Dusty slammed his hand flat on the table. The wood groaned, spoons jumped. The nervous chuckles vanished completely. "Speak up, girl," he boomed. "Can't hear a mouse squeak." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Lily Junn froze, the ladle trembling in her hand. She could feel every eye in that room burning into her. This was it, the moment where it all went wrong, the moment she'd have to pack her bags and run again. But not this time. She turned around, slow and deliberate. She looked Dusty Rohr straight in the eye. Her voice was still soft, but it carried a weight that stunned the room into a deeper silence. "Don't yell, sir," she said. "It hurts my hand." The words hung in the air, simple and strange and utterly defiant. Dusty just blinked, his face a perfect picture of confusion. He'd expected tears, or apologies, or maybe a frightened squeak. He hadn't expected this. His smirk faltered, replaced by a dark flush of anger that crept up his neck. "You sassin' me?" he growled, his voice a low rumble. And that's when the old man at the end of the table, Jedediah Holleran, moved. He didn't stand up. He didn't say a word. He just lifted his head, and his eyes, calm and gray as a storm cloud, met Dusty's across the long table. It was just a look. But it was enough. Dusty's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a sullen resentment. He muttered something under his breath, shoved a big spoonful of stew into his mouth, and the moment was over. Or so they thought. Later that night, after the men had shuffled off to their bunks, Jed found Lily Junn alone in the kitchen. The firelight danced across his weathered face, making the lines around his eyes look deeper. "You did fine," he said, his voice a low rasp. She looked up at him, her hands still shaking. "It won't make me friends." A strange, sad smile touched Jed's lips. "Some things ain't meant to." And then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the quiet of the night. Lily Junn stood there for a long time, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She hadn't expected kindness, but she also knew that a line had been drawn. And men like Dusty Roar didn't just let you draw a line in their dirt. They made you pay for it. In the bunkhouse, Dusty wasn't sleeping. He was sitting in the dark, nursing a bottle of whiskey and a bruised ego. He'd seen the look in Jed's eyes, a silent warning, and he hated it. He swore to himself that the new cook would learn her place, and Jed Holleran would learn who really ran this ranch, because Dusty Roar had a secret that gave him power. He believed this ranch, this land, all of it, should have been his. And he wasn't about to let some quiet old man and a drifter cook take that away from him. The storm hadn't passed. It was just gathering strength. News in a small town like Red Mesa travels faster than a prairie fire. By morning, the story of the new cook at the Holleran Ranch was on everyone's lips. But the story, as it always does, had changed in the telling. Mary Beth Langley, the woman who ran the local inn, told it with a sly smile while buying thread at the mercantile. "Can you imagine?" she whispered, her voice full of relish. "Stood right up to Dusty Roar, told him he hurt her hand with his yelling." The story twisted and turned with each retelling. Lily Junn wasn't just defiant, she was arrogant. She wasn't just a cook, she was a troublemaker. When Lily Junn rode into town for flour and salt, she felt the change immediately. The stares weren't just curious anymore. They were cold, judging. Men standing outside the blacksmith shop stopped talking as she passed, their eyes following her down the dusty street. "Pretty thing with a sharp tongue," one of them muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. "Won't last." At the mercantile, Mrs. Ellery, a woman who had been polite just a few days before, barely looked at her. Her lips were a thin, tight line as she bagged the flour. "Hope you like it out at the Holleran place," she said, her voice flat, but her eyes were full of a sharp, brittle judgment. Lily Junn kept her chin up, but inside, a familiar knot of dread tightened in her stomach. This was how it always started. The whispers, the cold shoulders, the slow, suffocating squeeze of a town that had decided it didn't want you. Back at the ranch, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Dusty moved with a kind of exaggerated swagger, his jokes louder, his laughter sharper. He never spoke to Lily Junn directly, but his words were always aimed at her. "Some folks get too big for their britches," he said to one of the hands while mending a saddle, his voice carrying across the yard to the kitchen. "Forget who signs their pay." Lily Junn kept working, her face a calm mask, but her hands trembled as she kneaded dough. Each push, each fold, felt like an act of defiance. She wanted to run. The urge to pack her small bag and disappear down that long dirt road was a physical ache. But then there was Jed. He never said much. He wasn't a man for easy words. But his actions spoke louder than any sermon. He noticed the way the kitchen door squeaked on its rusty hinges, and without a word, he oiled them until they swung silent. He saw her struggling to chop the tough, dry wood for the stove, and the next morning, a neat stack of perfectly split kindling was waiting for her by the door. He was watching. He was paying attention. Dusty noticed it too, and it ate at him like acid. Every quiet gesture from Jed was a challenge to his authority. Every silent act of respect for the cook was an insult. He was used to being the loudest voice in the room, the one men feared. Now, this quiet old man was undermining him without saying a single word. That night, Dusty cornered her in the mess hall after everyone else had gone. He had a whiskey bottle in his hand, and his eyes had a dangerous gleam. "Heard tell you've run out of a lot of towns, cook," he said, his voice a low, menacing purr. "What'd you do to earn a reputation like that?" Lily Junn froze, her back to him. "I just cooked," she said, her voice tight. He let out a short, ugly laugh. "That's what women like you always say. Then trouble just seems to follow." He took a step closer. She could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Keep your head down. Don't make Jed regret hiring you. He's got enough ghosts as it is." When he finally left, the room felt heavy with his threat. Lily Jun sank onto a bench, her knuckles white as she gripped a cleaning rag. Fear was a cold, familiar companion, but underneath it, a small, hot ember of anger began to glow. Just then, the door creaked open again. She jumped, her heart pounding. It was Jed. He didn't come all the way in. He just leaned against the door frame, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes met hers, and then dropped to the rag twisted in her hands. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer any false comfort. He simply walked over to the table, placed a clean, folded handkerchief beside her, and then turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. Lily Jun stared at the small square of white cloth. It was such a simple thing. But it was more than just a handkerchief. It was a message. You are not alone. And that's when she saw it. Stitched into the corner of the cloth, almost invisible in the dim light, were two small, faded initials. C.H. Claire Holleran, Jed's wife. The woman who had left him years ago. The woman the whole town whispered about. Suddenly, Dusty's words came back to her. He's got enough ghosts as it is. She realized with a jolt that the story everyone told about Jed's wife might not be the whole story, and the handkerchief in her hand felt less like a comfort and more like a clue to a secret that was buried deep in the heart of this ranch, a secret that might be far more dangerous than a foreman with a bruised ego. The quiet kindness of Jed Holleran was one thing, but this was different. This was a piece of his past, a piece of his pain, and he had just handed it to her. Days turned into weeks. The sun baked the prairie to a brittle golden brown. Lily Jun fell into a rhythm. She learned the quirks of the old wood stove, the preferences of the ranch hands, the long, silent language of Jed Holleran. The town of Red Mesa still watched her with suspicious eyes, but the whispers had quieted, replaced by a grudging curiosity. She was still here. She hadn't run. Dusty Roar, however, had not forgotten. He was like a snake coiled in the shade, waiting. He never confronted her directly again, but his presence was a constant, low-level threat. He'd make comments just under his breath, or accidentally trip a younger hand who was being too friendly to her. He was poisoning the well, one drop at a time. Jed saw it all. He continued his quiet support, a bucket of fresh water left by the kitchen door when the well pump was acting up. A rare, wild prairie rose, its petals a startling slash of pink, left on the windowsill one morning. He never acknowledged these gifts, and neither did she. They were a silent conversation, happening right under Dusty's nose. The handkerchief with the initials C.H. stayed tucked away in her apron pocket. It was a constant reminder that there were layers to this place, and to the quiet man who ran it. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and trace the faded letters with her finger. Who was Claire Holleran? Why did she leave? And why did Jed keep this small, intimate piece of her? One blistering afternoon, Jed approached her while she was tending the small herb garden she'd started behind the kitchen. "Wagons headed to town for supplies," he said, not quite looking at her. "Could use an extra hand." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. He could have managed alone, or sent one of the hands. This was something else, an invitation. She hesitated. A trip to town with Jed would set tongues wagging all over again. It would be like pouring oil on the smoldering fire of Dusty's resentment. But something in Jed's steady gaze, a kind of quiet insistence, made her say yes. The ride to town was mostly silent. The rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels were the only sounds. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared quiet, a space where words weren't needed. As they passed a small, abandoned homestead, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the endless grass, Lily Jun finally broke the quiet. "What happened to them?" she asked, nodding toward the derelict cabin. Jed's hands tightened on the reins. Family named Miller. Tried to make a go of it. The land, it doesn't forgive mistakes. He paused. And neither do people. He looked over at her, his eyes holding a deep, ancient sadness. This land remembers everything, Miss Carter, every kindness and every cruelty. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. She knew he wasn't just talking about the Miller family. The wind began to pick up, carrying the metallic smell of distant rain. By the time they finished their business in town, the sky to the west had turned a bruised, angry purple. Dark clouds boiled on the horizon. "Storm's coming in fast," Jed muttered, urging the horses into a quicker trot. "We won't make it back to the ranch." He veered the wagon off the main track, heading toward a small, dark shape huddled against a low ridge. "There's a line shack up ahead. We can wait it out there." They reached the shack just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. It was little more than a one-room wooden box with a rusty tin roof, but it was shelter. They unhitched the horses and led them into a small, attached lean-to. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and rain hammered on the tin roof, a deafening, relentless roar. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very ground beneath them. Inside, the tiny shack was dark and smelled of old wood, dust, and damp earth. A single, grimy window looked out onto a world that had dissolved into a gray, churning chaos. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, strangers brought together by the fury of the storm. The silence inside was a stark contrast to the noise outside, and it felt charged, intimate. Finally, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the wind, Lily Jun spoke. "I used to think if I just stayed quiet, I'd be safe," she said, her arms wrapped around herself. "Town after town, job after job. Just keep your head down, don't make waves. But the trouble, it always finds you anyway." Jed stared at the rough floorboards, his face etched in shadow. When he finally looked up, his eyes were full of a pain so deep it stole her breath. "It does," he said, his voice thick with regret. He took a deep, shuddering breath, like a man about to confess a mortal sin. "I had a wife once," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "Claire." Lily Jun's hand instinctively went to the handkerchief in her pocket. "She wasn't like me," Jed continued. "She wasn't quiet. She saw something wrong. She said something. There was a man in town. Powerful family. He was cheating folks, taking their land. Claire, she stood up to him, publicly." The rain beat against the roof, a frantic drum against the sudden, heavy silence in the shack. "I told her to let it be. I told her to keep her head down. I was afraid. Afraid of losing the ranch, afraid of making trouble." His voice dropped so low she could barely hear it. "She wouldn't back down. The town, it turned on her. The whispers, the cold shoulders, just like you." He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "One day she was just gone. Left a note. Said she couldn't live with a man who was more afraid of his neighbors than he was of losing his own soul." He finally looked at Lily Jun, his face a mask of anguish. "I didn't stand up for her. My silence. It cost me everything." The confession hung between them, raw and bleeding. This was the ghost Dusty had talked about. This was the source of Jed's quiet sadness and his fierce, unspoken defense of her. He was trying to right a wrong that was 20 years old, but then he said something that changed everything. "The man she stood up to," Jed said, his voice a dead, flat monotone. "His name was Elias Rohr." Lily Jun's blood ran cold. "Rohr?" she whispered. Jed nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Dusty's father." The storm outside raged on, but a different kind of storm had just broken inside the tiny shack. This wasn't just a random conflict between a bully and a newcomer. This was old. This was a blood feud. Dusty wasn't just tormenting her because she was defiant. He was tormenting her because, in her, he saw a ghost. the ghost of the woman who had dared to challenge his family's power. And in protecting her, Jed wasn't just being kind. He was fighting a war he had lost once before. Suddenly, the stakes were infinitely higher. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about survival. And she was standing right in the middle of a battle that had started long before she ever set foot in Red Mesa. The revelation hit Lily Junn like a physical blow. Dusty's cruelty wasn't random. It was inherited. A dark legacy passed down from father to son. And Jed's quiet protection of her. It was an act of penance, an attempt to rewrite the ending of a story that had haunted him for decades. She was no longer just a cook. She was a pawn in a generational war. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. But inside the shack, the air had cleared. The secrets were out, laid bare between them in the dim, dusty light. She told him about the towns she'd fled, the whispers that had driven her from job after job. She spoke of a loneliness so profound, it felt like a constant chill in her bones. He listened, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no pity in his eyes, only a deep, shared understanding. Two people who had learned the hard way that silence could be as violent as a fist. When the storm finally broke, they stepped out into a world that felt brand new. The air was clean and sharp, washed by the rain. The sun broke through the clouds, painting the wet prairie in strokes of silver and gold. The ride back to the ranch was different. The silence between them was no longer just comfortable, it was solid, a bond forged in shared pain and revelation. But as they topped the final ridge and saw the ranch spread out below them, a sense of dread washed over Lily Junn. The ranch was too quiet. There were no men in the yard, no smoke curling from the bunkhouse chimney. And Dusty Rohr was waiting for them on the porch of the main house. He wasn't alone. He was flanked by two hard-faced men she'd never seen before, strangers with guns holstered low on their hips. A few of the younger ranch hands stood off to the side, their faces pale and worried. Dusty had a piece of paper in his hand. He held it up as Jed and Lily Junn pulled the wagon to a stop. A smug, triumphant grin spread across his face. "Evening, Jed," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "While you were out, enjoying the storm, we had a little visitor." He gestured to one of the strangers. "This here is Mr. Corbin, from the Cattlemen's Association Bank." Jed's face went rigid. He slowly climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff. "What is this, Dusty?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Dusty's grin widened. "It's a foreclosure notice, old man." He waved the paper. "Seems you're a little behind on your payments. Quite a bit behind, in fact. My father, being the generous man he is, well, he bought your debt from the bank. I guess you could say the Holleran Ranch now belongs to the Rohr family." It was a coup, a bloodless, perfectly legal coup. While Jed was protecting the ghost of his past, Dusty had stolen his future. The younger hands looked at the ground, ashamed. They'd been powerless to stop it. "You won't get away with this," Jed growled, taking a step forward. Mr. Corbin, the banker, put a hand on the butt of his gun. "It's all legal and binding, Mr. Holleran. The deed is signed. The ranch is no longer yours. You and your employee have until sundown tomorrow to vacate the premises." Lily Junn felt the ground drop out from under her. She had just found a place where she might, finally, be safe, a place where she wasn't alone, and now it was being ripped away. But it was the look in Dusty's eyes that terrified her the most. It wasn't just triumph, it was a cold, possessive hunger, and it was directed right at her. "Don't you worry, Cook," Dusty said, his voice a slimy caress. "There'll still be a place for you here. A woman ought to know her place after all, and I'm going to take great pleasure in teaching you yours." The threat was unmistakable. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about power, about humiliation. Jed had beaten him once, shamed him in front of his men. Now, Dusty was going to burn down everything Jed cared about, starting with the woman he had tried so hard to protect. Jed had lost his ranch, and Lily Junn was about to lose much, much more. The air crackled with a tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Jed stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He had spent 20 years living with the ghost of his failure to protect Claire, and now history was repeating itself in the most brutal way imaginable. He had lost his ranch, his legacy, everything his family had built, all because of a debt he didn't even know existed. A debt? Jed's voice was a hoarse whisper. I've paid my bills. Dusty let out a cruel laugh. You paid the local bank, but your father, he took out a second mortgage, years ago. A private loan. From my father. He tapped the foreclosure notice. The terms were very specific. A single missed payment, and the property reverts. And you missed one. Last month. It was a lie. A trap, and they all knew it. There was no missed payment. Elias Rohr had simply waited for the perfect moment to spring his trap, a trap he had likely set decades ago. Get off my land, Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. The two hired guns straightened up, their hands hovering over their pistols. Dusty's smirk never wavered. It's not your land anymore, old man, he said. Now I'm feeling generous. I'll let you pack a bag. But she stays. His eyes locked onto Lily Junn, and a cold dread washed over her. She knew what he meant. He wasn't offering her a job. He was claiming her as a spoil of war. But as she stood there, paralyzed by fear, something shifted inside her. It was the memory of all the other towns, all the other bullies, all the other times she had run. It was the memory of Jed's confession in the line shack, the quiet dignity of his pain. It was the feel of the handkerchief in her pocket, a small, tangible piece of a woman who had refused to be silenced. She took a step forward, putting herself slightly in front of Jed. She looked Dusty Rohr dead in the eye. No, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was clear and cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Dusty's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed into slits of fury. What did you say? She said no. A new voice cut in. One of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Billy who couldn't be more than 17, had stepped forward. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. This is Jed's ranch, Billy said, his voice cracking but firm. Then another hand stepped forward, and another. Within moments, the half-dozen ranch hands who had been loyal to Jed had formed a loose, uncertain line between him and Dusty's men. They were outnumbered and unarmed, but they were standing their ground. Dusty looked at them, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had expected them to fold, to follow the new power. "You're all fired!" he spat. "Get off this ranch with him!" "Gladly," one of the older hands grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Dusty's boots. For a moment, it looked like guns would be drawn. The air was electric, but Dusty, for all his bluster, was a coward at heart. He didn't want a fair fight. He wanted to win by default. He laughed, a high, ugly sound. "Fine. Be fools. This land is mine. The law is on my side. You have until sundown tomorrow." He turned and swaggered back into the house, his hired guns following close behind. The door slammed shut, a final, arrogant punctuation mark. A heavy silence fell over the yard. The ranch hands looked at Jed, their faces a mixture of loyalty and despair. They had made their stand, but they had all just lost their jobs and their homes. Jed looked at the closed door of the house he had been born in. He looked at the faces of the men who had stood with him. He looked at Lily Junn, her small frame radiating a strength that humbled him. The fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. "He said sundown tomorrow," Jed said, his voice rough with emotion, but steady as a rock. "That gives us time." "Time for what, boss?" Billy asked, his newfound bravery wavering. "The paper's signed. It's legal." Jed's eyes scanned the horizon, as if looking for an answer in the vast, empty sky. "He's right. We can't fight him with fists or guns. We have to fight him with the truth." He turned to Lily Junn. "The line shack, where we waited out the storm." She looked at him, confused. "What about it?" "My father built it," Jed said, a strange light coming into his eyes. He kept things there, things he didn't want my mother to find. Old papers, journals." He paused, his gaze intense. "Things he didn't want Elias Rohr to find." A flicker of hope, fragile but fierce, ignited in Lily June's chest. A secret, a hidden history. "Dusty thinks he's won because he has a piece of paper," Jed said, his voice growing stronger. "But my father always said, the land remembers, and so do the walls." It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all they had. They had until sundown to find a ghost in an old, abandoned shack. A ghost that could prove Dusty's claim was built on a foundation of lies. A ghost that could save them all. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the prairie, they made a plan. They had one night. One night to uncover a secret buried for decades. They rode out under the cover of darkness, a small, determined posse. Jed, Lily Junn, and the few loyal hands. The main house, their house, was now enemy territory, its windows glowing with a triumphant alien light. Dusty and his men were inside, drinking, celebrating their victory. The ride to the line shack was tense and silent. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. Every rustle of the sagebrush, every distant cry of a coyote, sounded like a threat. The shack was just as they'd left it, a dark, lonely shape against the star-dusted sky. Inside, it was cold and smelled of rain-soaked earth. They lit a single lantern, its flickering light casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the rough wooden walls. "What are we looking for?" Billy asked, his voice a nervous whisper. "I'm not sure," Jed admitted. He ran his hand along the wall, his touch both rough and reverent. "My father was a complicated man. He and Elias Rohr, they grew up together. Friends, then rivals. There was always a current of darkness between them." They started searching. It felt hopeless. The shack was tiny, just one room. There was a rusted stove, a rickety table, a few broken crates. Nothing else. They checked every corner, every crack in the floorboards. Nothing. Hours passed. The moon climbed higher in the sky. Despair began to set in. Lily Junn stood in the middle of the room, the lantern light catching the worry in her eyes. She thought about the handkerchief, the initials CH. She thought about Jed's story, the story of a woman who stood up to a powerful man and paid the price. Her eyes fell on the hearth, a simple construction of flat river stones. Something about it seemed wrong. One of the stones at the back, a large, flat piece of slate, was slightly askew. It didn't sit flush with the others. "Jed," she said, her voice quiet. "Look here." They gathered around the hearth. Jed ran his fingers over the stone. It was loose. Using the tip of a knife, he pried at the edge. With a low groan, the stone shifted. Beneath it was a hollowed-out space, and inside that space was a small tin box, rusted shut with age. Their breath caught in their throats. This was it. It had to be. With trembling hands, Jed lifted the box out. It was heavy. He worked the lid back and forth, the rusty metal screeching in protest, until it finally popped open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed cloth, was a thick, leather-bound journal, and something else. A small, tarnished silver locket. Jed picked up the locket first. He fumbled with the clasp, his big, calloused fingers clumsy with emotion. It sprang open. On one side was a tiny, faded portrait of a young woman with defiant eyes and a small, sad smile. On the other side, inscribed in elegant script, were the words, "My dearest Claire, forever yours, Elias." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the frantic pounding of Lily Junn's own heart. Claire hollerin', and Elias roar. Jed stared at the locket, his face ashen. He had it all wrong. All of it. The story he'd told himself for 20 years. The story of his wife leaving him because of his cowardice. It was a lie. He slowly opened the journal. The first page was dated 30 years ago. The handwriting was his father's. Elias has gone too far, he read aloud, his voice shaking. He thinks he owns this valley. He thinks he owns everyone in it. Today he came to me with a proposition, a partnership, but it felt more like a threat. He speaks of progress, of bringing the railroad through. But I see only greed. I refused him. He turned the page. Claire came to see me today. She is afraid of Elias. He is obsessed with her. He follows her. He sends her gifts. She refuses him, but he doesn't listen. Jed is blind to it. He sees Elias as a friend. Lily June felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This wasn't a story about a woman who left. This was a story about a woman who was being stalked. Jed's hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the book. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the frantic script of a man watching a tragedy unfold. Then he stopped, his face draining of all color. He read the final entry in a choked, broken whisper. Claire is gone. Elias came for her in the night. He said she went with him willingly. He showed me a note in her handwriting. But I know my son. Jed stood up to him, finally. There was a fight. Jed believes she left him. Perhaps it is better that way. Better he think her gone than know the truth. Elias has a darkness in him. He gave me a choice. My silence, in exchange for my son's life. He has sworn to ruin us if I ever speak of it. He has taken everything from me. My son's wife, my son's spirit. I am a coward. May God forgive me. The journal slipped from Jed's fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The truth was 1,000 times worse than the ghost he had been living with. Claire hadn't left him. She had been taken. Stolen by the man he thought was his friend, the father of the man who had just stolen his home. And his own father had been blackmailed into silence to protect him. This whole time, Jed had been mourning a wife he thought had abandoned him, but Claire Holleran hadn't been his wife. The locket, the journal, it all pointed to one horrifying conclusion. He looked at Lily Jun, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. The town records, he whispered. I was never married. Claire wasn't his wife. She was his sister. And Elias Rohr hadn't just driven her away. He'd kidnapped her. The story Jed had told, the story the town believed, was a fiction created by his father to protect him from a truth so monstrous he might not have survived it. Dusty Rohr wasn't just the son of his rival, he was the son of the man who had stolen his sister. The battle for the ranch was no longer about land or money or pride. It was about a crime that had been buried for a generation, and they had just dug it up. The weight of the discovery settled over them, a suffocating blanket of grief and horror. Jed sank onto a wooden crate, the strong, steady man shattered, his face buried in his hands. The foundation of his life, the regret that had defined his entire adulthood, was a lie. A lie constructed to protect him, but a lie nonetheless. My sister, he choked out, the words torn from him. All this time, I thought, I let her down, but I never even knew what the real fight was. Lily Jun knelt beside him, her own fear momentarily forgotten in the face of his immense pain. She placed a hand on his shoulder. There were no words for this. Billy and the other hands stood by the door, their faces grim, witnesses to a history they had never known existed. But grief would have to wait. The clock was ticking. Sundown was coming. Jed, Lily Jun said softly, her voice cutting through his haze of shock. Jed, listen to me. This changes everything. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and lost. It changes nothing. He still has the deed. He still has the law on his side. No, she said. her voice gaining a hard, determined edge. She picked up the journal from the floor. This isn't just a journal, it's a confession, blackmail, extortion, kidnapping. She held up the tarnished locket. And this is proof. A flicker of light returned to Jed's eyes. She was right. This was more than a family tragedy. It was evidence. Dusty doesn't know this exists, she went on, her mind racing. He thinks he's playing the same game his father did. He's arrogant. He's celebrating. He won't be expecting us. A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. They couldn't go to the sheriff. The Rohr family likely owned him too. They couldn't win with force. They had to win with the one thing Dusty didn't have: the truth. The cattle drive ends tomorrow. One of the older hands, a man named Hank, spoke up. His voice was a low rumble. The whole town will be at the saloon for the celebration. All the other ranch owners, the merchants, everyone. Jed slowly got to his feet. The shattered look on his face was hardening into something new, a cold, righteous fury. He was no longer the man haunted by regret. He was the man whose sister had been stolen. "We're not leaving," Jed said, his voice flat and cold as iron. "We're going to take back my home, and we're going to do it in front of the whole world." They rode back to the ranch, not in stealth, but openly, as the first pale light of dawn touched the sky. They didn't go to the main house. They went to the bunkhouse, their territory, and waited. Word must have spread that they were back, because it wasn't long before Dusty Rohr appeared, his face flushed with anger and leftover whiskey. His 2 hired guns were with him. "I told you to be gone by sundown," he snarled. Jed stepped out of the bunkhouse to face him. He looked like a different man. The weariness was gone, replaced by an unshakable resolve. "We're not going anywhere, Dusty," he said. Dusty laughed. "You have no choice. This is my property now." "Is it?" Jed said, his voice dangerously calm. "Is it your property? Or did your father steal it, just like he stole my sister?" The color drained from Dusty's face. For the first time, his arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Jed took a step forward, holding up the locket so it caught the morning sun. "My dearest Claire, forever yours, Elias." Dusty stared at the locket as if it were a venomous snake. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "The land remembers, Dusty," Jed said, his voice like gravel. "It remembers everything, the blackmail, the threats, the night your father took a woman who didn't want him." Dusty's fear was quickly being replaced by a desperate, cornered animal rage. "Lies! My father was a respected man. You're just a crazy old fool who can't accept that he's lost." He was panicking. Jed's words had hit their mark. "We'll see who the town believes," Jed said. "Tonight, at the saloon, we're going to have a public reading from a journal my father kept, a journal that details every crime your family has ever committed against mine." This was their gamble. To call him out publicly, to force a confession, or, at the very least, plant the seeds of doubt in the minds of the entire community. Dusty's hand twitched toward his gun. "You'll be dead before you ever get to town." "Maybe," Jed said, unflinching. "But these men heard you. They'll tell the story. And everyone will know that the Rohr family fortune is built on kidnapping and blackmail. Your name will be mud in this valley forever." Dusty was trapped. A public accusation was a disaster, but a quiet murder, right after taking over the ranch under suspicious circumstances, was just as bad. He was caught in the web of his own family's lies. He stared at Jed, his mind racing, searching for a way out. His eyes were wild, his bravado completely gone. Finally, he spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he hissed. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward the house, his hired guns looking uncertain for the first time. They had won the first round. They had planted the fear of exposure, but they had also shown their hand. Now Dusty knew what they had, and he had until nightfall to figure out how to stop them. The final showdown wouldn't be a quiet affair in a dusty yard. It would be a public spectacle, and only one family's story would survive the telling. The day passed in a state of suspended animation. The sun beat down on the quiet ranch, the air thick with anticipation. Jed and his men stayed close to the bunkhouse, cleaning their weapons, speaking in low, hushed tones. They weren't preparing for a debate. They were preparing for a war. They knew Dusty wouldn't let them get to town without a fight. Lily Junn made a huge pot of coffee, her hands moving with a steady automatic calm. But inside, her nerves were screaming. She had come to this place seeking refuge, a quiet corner of the world to hide in. Now she was at the heart of a storm, a catalyst for a conflict that had been simmering for a generation. She looked at Jed, who sat by the window, staring out at the house that was no longer his, the leather-bound journal resting on his lap. The lines on his face seemed to have deepened overnight, carved by grief and a terrible, cold rage. As the afternoon wore on, they saw movement up at the main house. Dusty and his 2 men were saddling their horses, but they weren't riding out. They were taking up positions, one by the main gate, one on the ridge overlooking the road. They were boxing them in. "He's not going to let us leave," Billy said, his voice tight with fear. "We're not asking for his permission," Jed said, standing up. He tucked the journal inside his coat. The locket was in his vest pocket. "It's time." They had to make it to town. They had to get the story out. Their plan was simple and desperate. Jed and Hank would create a diversion, riding hard toward the south pasture, drawing the attention of the man on the ridge. While they were occupied, Lily Junn, protected by Billy and the 2 other hands, would take the wagon and make a break for the main road. It was a long shot. They were outgunned and outmaneuvered. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red, Jed pulled Lily Junn aside. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This isn't your fight." She looked up at him, into those steady gray eyes that now held a lifetime of new pain. "You stood up for me when no one else would," she said softly. "You made this my fight. I'm seeing it through." He nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished locket. "If something happens to me," he said, pressing it into her hand, "you show them this. You tell them her name. Claire." Her fingers closed around the cool metal. It felt heavy, weighted with the history of a life stolen too soon. The diversion began with a thunder of hooves. Jed and Hank galloped across the open field, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. As expected, the man on the ridge turned his attention, firing back at the decoys. "Now!" one of the hands hissed. Billy slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, careening down the dusty track toward the main road. Lily Junn held on tight, her heart pounding against her ribs, the journal clutched to her chest. They were almost to the gate when the second gunman appeared, riding hard to cut them off. He raised his rifle, taking aim. One of the hands in the back of the wagon fired back, the shots echoing across the plains. The gunman's horse shied, giving them the opening they needed. Billy urged their horses on, and they burst through the gate and onto the main road to Red Mesa. They had made it out, but they could hear the sounds of gunfire fading behind them. They didn't know if Jed and Hank were safe. They just had to keep going. The ride to town was a blur of frantic speed and choking dust. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. When the first lights of Red Mesa finally appeared in the twilight, a wave of relief washed over Lily Junn. But their ordeal wasn't over. As they clattered down the main street, another rider emerged from a dark alleyway, blocking their path. It was Dusty. He had a pistol in his hand, and his face was a pale, twisted mask of desperation. "That's far enough," he snarled. He had outsmarted them, riding ahead to cut them off before they reached the safety of the crowded saloon. Billy pulled the wagon to a halt. The street was quiet. Most of the townsfolk already gathered for the celebration. They were alone. "Give me the book," Dusty demanded, his gun leveled at Lily Junn. She clutched the journal tighter. No. You think anyone will believe the ramblings of a dead man? He sneered. My father runs this town. His word against a ghost's? It's no contest. Maybe, a calm voice said from the shadows of a nearby doorway. But what about his word? The town sheriff stepped out into the street. But he wasn't alone. With him were a dozen men, ranchers, merchants, blacksmiths, all holding rifles. Dusty stared at them, his mouth falling open. Sheriff? What is this? I told you Holleran was crazy. The sheriff, a weathered man named Tate, shook his head slowly. Hank made it to town first, Dusty. Rode in like the devil was on his tail, told us your side of the story, then he told us Jed's. He gestured to the assembled townsfolk. We decided we'd like to hear the end of it. Just then, two more riders appeared at the end of the street. It was Jed and Hank. They were dusty and grim-faced, but they were alive. Dusty was surrounded. The whole town had turned out to witness the final act. His power, built on his father's reputation and whispered threats, was evaporating before his eyes. He was cornered, and he knew it. His eyes darted around, wild and frantic. Then, with a desperate roar, he spurred his horse forward, straight toward Lily Junn. He wasn't trying to get the book anymore. He was trying to silence the witness. But before he could reach her, another figure stepped out from the crowd. It was Mary Beth Langley, the innkeeper, the town's chief gossip. And in her hands, she held an old, heavy shotgun. She raised it, her movement steady and sure. You Roar men have been poisoning this town for long enough, she said, her voice ringing with a conviction no one had ever heard from her before. This ends tonight. Dusty pulled his horse to a skidding stop, staring at the woman he'd always dismissed as a harmless busybody. He was facing not just Jed, not just the sheriff, but the collective will of a town that had finally had enough. He was beaten. And in his eyes, Lily Junn saw not just defeat, but the terrifying, hollow emptiness of a man whose entire identity was a lie, the son of a thief and a kidnapper. Slowly, his gun hand dropped to his side. It was over. The truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. In the center of the saloon, with the entire town of Red Mesa as witness, Jed Holleran read from his father's journal. He told the story of Claire, his sister, a vibrant woman silenced by a powerful, obsessive man. He told the story of his father's impossible choice and his own 20 years of mislaid guilt. When he was finished, a profound silence filled the room. No one looked at Dusty, who stood in the corner, flanked by the sheriff, his face a pale, slack mask of shame. The stories, the whispers, the half-truths that had defined Red Mesa for a generation had been burned away by the clean, hard light of the truth. Elias Roar wasn't a town founder. He was a monster, and his son was his heir. The legalities were sorted out quickly. The foreclosure, based on a fraudulent debt born of blackmail, was nullified. The Holleran Ranch belonged to Jed once more. Dusty Roar and his hired guns were taken into custody, not just for their actions at the ranch, but under suspicion for a host of other crimes the Roar family had committed over the years. The town, it seemed, had a long memory, and it was finally ready to speak. In the days that followed, a quiet transformation took place. The fear that had always lurked beneath the surface of Red Mesa began to dissipate. People talked to each other more freely. Old feuds were mended. Mary Beth Langley, the woman with the shotgun, stopped trafficking in whispers and started dealing in kindness. Back at the ranch, the air felt different, lighter. The men who had stood by Jed worked with a new sense of pride. They weren't just hands. They were part of something. They had chosen a side, and their side had won. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in soft shades of lavender and rose, Lily Junn found Jed standing on the porch, looking out over the vast, peaceful plains. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time. The quiet between them was no longer filled with unspoken secrets, but with a shared understanding, a deep and abiding respect. "What will you do now?" she finally asked. He was quiet for a moment, turning the small silver locket over in his hands. "For 20 years I thought I was honoring her memory by holding on to my guilt," he said, his voice soft. "But that's not what she would have wanted. She was a fighter. She would have wanted me to live." He looked at her, and for the first time, the sadness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a gentle, steady warmth. "This ranch isn't just a piece of land to me anymore. It's a promise. To do what my father couldn't. To build a place where people are safe, where they don't have to be afraid to speak up." He paused, then added, "A place where people can choose to stay." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Could she stay? After all the running, all the fear, had she finally found a home? She looked out at the endless grass, the vast open sky. It no longer looked empty to her. It looked full of possibility. She thought of the whispers, the cold shoulders, the constant threat of violence she had faced, and she thought of the small, quiet acts of courage that had defeated it. A fixed door, a folded handkerchief, a shared story in a storm, a group of men forming an unarmed line, a woman with a shotgun. "I think," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "I'm tired of running." They stood together on the porch, two survivors who had found in each other not a grand passion, but something quieter, stronger, and more real. A safe harbor. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying not the ghosts of the past, but the promise of a new day. The line had been drawn, the storm had been weathered, and justice, quiet and steady, had finally come to Red Mesa. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of hidden history and the quiet heroes who bring it to light.